Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Samantha Bradshaw, Fellow at the Stanford Internet Observatory, Cyber Policy Center.
Hi, everybody. I'm Samantha Bradshaw. I'd like to welcome you all to today's session on New Frontiers in Peacebuilding, where we're going to be talking about the role of social media in conflict and peacebuilding. So, social media platforms can be a positive space for people to connect, forge linkages, and mobilize for human rights, accountability, and peace. But platforms can also drive polarization and extremism, be used to incite violence and hate, and erode the integrity of democracy. In today's session, we're going to explore how social media can be harnessed more effectively for peacebuilding processes and assess various human rights-based and conflict-sensitive policy responses to harmful disinformation and to the misuse of technology. Before we get today's conversation started, I'd like to introduce our various distinguished speakers here on the panel today. So in the studio, Robert Rydberg is the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs in Sweden. Mr. Rydberg has served at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for many years, including as ambassador to the Italian Republic, the State of Israel, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. He's also served as chair of the EU Committee for Civilian Aspects of Crisis Management and was coordinator for Security Council Affairs during the Swedish membership of the UN Security Council. Teresa Ribeiro is the special representative on freedom of the media for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the OSCE. Prior to this role, Ms. Ribeiro was the Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Portugal, while also serving as President of the National Commission for Human Rights. Daniel Braun is the Deputy Head of Cabinet of Vera Jourova, Vice President of the European Commission for Values and Transparency. Daniel's portfolio includes fundamental human rights, interinstitutional relations, and economic and monetary affairs. Mr. Braun also initiated deliberations between the European Commission and major IT platforms, which led to the adoption of the Codex on Illegal Racism on the Internet. And as a note for the audience, Mr. Braun will have to disconnect from the panel at approximately 4:40. Maria Ressa is here with us today as well. Maria is a journalist, an author, and the CEO of Rappler, the top digital-only news site leading the fight for press freedom in the Philippines. For her courage and work on disinformation, Maria was named Time Magazine's 2018 Person of the Year, was among its 100 most influential people of 2019, and has also been named one of Time's most influential women of the century. Maria has won multiple awards around the world for her work in journalism and press freedom. We're delighted to have her here today. And finally, a little bit later, Miranda Seisens should be joining us. Miranda joined Facebook in 2019 as the Director of Human Rights Policy. She brings 20 plus years of experience in human rights research and policymaking. As a former diplomat, Miranda has worked at Miranda's worked at Human Rights Watch as the Chief of Staff at the International Center for Transitional Justice and has consulted for the UN Human Rights Office. So for the audience and for everybody who's here watching us today through the Stockholm Forum panel, you can send your questions in the questions field to the right of the player window. I believe if there's no transition video, then we can jump into questions. Okay, it's coming.
Misinformation and disinformation on social media make peacebuilding more difficult. In 2020, at least 81 countries use social media to spread disinformation about politics. How can social media be harnessed more effectively for peacebuilding?
Excellent. So to start off today's conversation, Robert, I'd love for you to kick us off. Broadly speaking, what's the biggest challenge you see around social media, peace building, and conflict? I know many of these issues are not new, but the technology is. So, how do you think technology changes the way conflicts evolve and the ways that they can be addressed?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, access to information is, of course, an integral part of the right of freedom of opinion and expression. Technology enables more individuals across the globe than ever to be informed. Social media platforms can be positive spaces where people can connect, create linkages and mobilize. They can also be enablers for the enjoyment of human rights, accountability and peace. However, as you point out, social media platforms can also drive polarization, radicalization and extremism, be used to incite violence and hatred, as we have seen in several ongoing conflicts. We need to be aware of the structural role of technology itself. The use of artificial intelligence to increase user engagements drives people towards ever more radical content. It also pushes individuals to choose media outlets which confirm their biased opinions. This has profound consequences for the functioning of our democracies. We must remember, of course, that the issue of technologies in conflict is at its core not new. We need only to look at the role played by radio stations, for example, during the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, to be reminded of the massive influence of media and mass communication on conflicts. However, the world has evolved a lot since 1994. The digital landscape has become more complex and dynamic. New platforms, new actors, and new methods of communications continuously evolve. Therefore, today, a rumor forwarded by thousands of people in a matter of seconds can instantly change the information landscape and create conflicts or strengthen peace. Technology evolves fast, and things that we considered science fiction a few years ago are now a reality. With relatively few resources, conflict actors can already use deep fake technology to sow conflict and distrust. And if used on a large scale, this can severely undermine the possibility to create shared understanding and compromise. We also see how this is in a very determined way used also by state powers. It's important, I think, that both mediators and diplomats develop a more sophisticated understanding of the impact of technology. This includes, of course, also how conflict parties use digital technologies today to achieve their goals. We must also gather knowledge on how effectively to make use of technologies to monitor conflict situations and how to ensure that digital technologies are used to solve rather than to worsen conflicts.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Robert. Teresa, I'm wondering if you could bring in the OSCE perspective and tell us what you think about the role of social media in peace building processes, particularly if you could describe some of the main threat actors and how they target peace processes, or describe maybe where individuals are most likely to encounter mis and disinformation or other new threats.
Very sorry. So it's really a pleasure to be here with you. Allow me just to commend Maria Ressa as she is today with us. She just won a prize, another one, and so for that, congratulations. You really deserve for the incredible work you have been done throughout the years, and your courage, your bravery. So congratulations once again, and thank you very much. I would like very much, before going specifically to the answer, I would like very much to recall some data illustrating how increasingly important social media are. In early 2021, so this year, the social media, they had 4.2 billion users. It gives us the scale and the importance of the social media. This is an impressive number. That increased in last year and this year compared to 2019, of course, because of the COVID-19 that played a decisive role in such a spectacular growth, 13% more, because people need to adapt to the challenges of the COVID-19. But this is the kind of growth that will not go back. The tendency, the trend will be, of course, just to continue to increase. So this is where we are regarding social media. 4.2 billion users in the world. It's enormous, but at the same time, and this is also important to mention, we have 3.2 billion people around the world that still don't use internet, and women are still underrepresented online. This is also another important figure for our discussion. I don't want to demonize the social media. Social media are very, very important for freedom of expression and media freedom. Is a spectacular instrument for the expansion of media freedom and freedom of expression. But of course, there are challenges associated, and they are very important. And maybe what we need, especially if we think about very sensitive situations like conflict situation, is to build a new ecosystem. And to build this new ecosystem, we need much more civil society involved. We need, because civil society will be a source of legitimacy, we need the platforms involved. This is very, very important, because what bleeds leads, which means that they are very much betting in engaging the users. And so sometimes they use the algorithms in a way that doesn't help in normal situations, doesn't help in conflict situations, of course, for obvious reasons. So we need these new ecosystems. We need a new trust in the media. And And for that, more involvement of civil society, more involvement of the platforms, and more involvement of the states. We need a clear, transparent regulation, but a very light one, and one that definitely does not represent a threat to freedom of expression. This is very important. And we need the platforms because the platforms, they are, their values are assigned to their shareholders, not to human rights. So the states they have positive obligations in creating the right approach, the right ecosystem where human rights are respected. And freedom of expression is an important human right to be respected. And by the way, is a very central one. If we don't have freedom of expression, if we don't have media freedom, it will be much more difficult for the others' human rights to be exercised. This is also very important.
Thank you, Teresa. I think.
Okay.
Yes, I really would love to pick up on exactly how you envision some of these collaborations with civil society and what the processes for addressing some of these changes and challenges are. I'd like to get into that a little bit later. If we could maybe pivot to Maria, I'd love for you to still focusing here on the challenges, describe some of the concrete ways that disinformation is exacerbating some conflict in the Philippines, and picking up on what Teresa was saying around, a lot of digital inequalities still exist. For example, women are still very underrepresented online. I'm wondering if there are certain communities, women, minorities, others who also disproportionately experience some of these threats when they are online. Are certain people or groups more vulnerable to disinformation, and how does this contribute to further conflict?
Thanks, Sam. So I think it's more not even that they're more vulnerable as in more targeted. So yes, danger comes up, right? Women, people of color, the LGBTQ, those who are already marginalized become even more vulnerable because, this is laid out in the UNESCO report, The Chilling, that's written by ICFJ's Julie Passetti. Look, I mean, I feel like I've been talking about the dangers of social media since 2016, and I have. So I'm kind of feeling like Sisyphus and Cassandra combined. And what I've seen, look, Rappler was created on social media, Facebook. There were times when we knew Facebook better than Facebook knew it in the Philippines. But over the last 5 years, what we've also seen is that social media has become a behavior modification system. And we've become Pavlov's dogs that are kind of experimented on in real time, and the consequences are disastrous. On social media right now, all the studies have shown that lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further than facts, because we spend our careers as journalists learning how to make facts interesting. The social media platforms that deliver the facts to us are biased against facts. They're biased against journalists, and frankly, they're biased against meaningful conversations. By design, they are dividing us and radicalizing us. So this isn't a free speech issue. It's not the fault of people using the platform. These platforms are not just mirroring humanity or human behavior. They're actually making us our worst selves, right? If you have the devil and the angel on your shoulder, they've gagged the angel and the devil has been puffed up. It's creating emergent behavior that literally feeds on violence and fear, uncertainty, And what we've seen, I think this is your report, the Oxford University Computational Propaganda Research Project. The latest report now says the cheap armies on social media are rolling back democracy in 81 countries around the world. So it's enabling fascism, and I simplify it, and I've said this over and over. Without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without trust, we can't actually do anything because we have no shared reality. And that means that it is impossible to deal with these existential problems we have. Climate has always been there. Coronavirus is there now. And then I always bring up that it's almost like an atom bomb exploded in our information ecosystem. And that happened when journalists lost our gatekeeping powers to technology companies. Because as we've seen, tech abdicated responsibility for the public sphere. The cost to me, part of the reason I'm so certain about this is when we came out with a propaganda war series in 2016. It's a 3-part series. I wrote 2 of the 3 parts. Right after we came out with that, I got inundated with 90 hate messages per hour. Sam, we've talked about this, right? The cost of this now is that in less than 2 years, the Philippine government has filed 10 arrest warrants against me. So the exponential propaganda that is seeded rises bottom up and then top down, matched by President Duterte himself. I've had to post bail 10 times in order to stay free. And yet, I continue to appeal for enlightened self-interest from the social media platforms because, frankly, if nothing fundamental changes, it'll set the tone for the next decade, and it isn't a world that we want to be in.
Thank you for that, Maria. I love the passion that you bring to these conversations and what you describe in the Philippines in terms of the various propaganda and disinformation campaigns launched against you and against journalists more broadly in the country. I'm very glad that you're speaking out and speaking and standing up for these values around freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Daniel, I'm wondering if you could maybe expand on some of these ideas, thinking a little bit around disinformation as a means to drive conflict and how this might be changing. Maria painted a very good picture of how this is happening today and in the present with today's technologies. I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the future, the evolution of tactics, either through technical innovation or attack vectors like alternative platforms like Telegram or Gab or Parler, and if some of these kind of new things about technology or the landscape change the problem. And I'm wondering if you could also talk a little bit about some of the key concerns here for future policy making when it comes to social media and conflict.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to such a big and wide-ranging event and to be on a panel with such interesting and distinguished co-panelists. So it's an honor for me. And indeed, disinformation, I think, is changing in many ways. Digital transformation became in COVID a total part of our lives, I would say, which also increases, I think, the role of regulators to put order into it so that it's to our benefits and not the harms that we heard from the previous speakers. And I think COVID especially made disinformation a more mainstream topic because everybody saw that it can lead to real harms. You had attacks on 5G infrastructure, massive influx of vaccine disinformation that we saw can cost lives. As we were assessing at the end of last year the self-regulatory code of practice with the platforms, we also found that a major shortcoming was the lack of progress of demonetization of disinformation. So besides the political motives, which I will talk about, the financial incentives are very much present, and this space needs to be reduced. Now, in terms of techniques, these became much more varied than, let's say, in 2016, when we focused mostly on bots and partly fake accounts. And now there seems to be a much wider range of fake engagements, deep fakes, as the State Secretary mentioned, hack and leak operations, account takeovers, creation of inauthentic groups, using co-opted legitimate actors also. And often indeed by states that use this breakdown of shared reality. And in many ways, this really needs to be seen as part of a hybrid operation often. And this can be linked also to concrete events like elections, where the rules we have now are obviously not designed for the digital environment. And when you can combine profiling, micro-targeting, you potentially undermine the ability to disagree together, but still be a part of free and open democratic process. And I would just like to stress one thing, that we need to be careful to differentiate between disinformation and foreign influence operations, where you have the aspect of intent, and misinformation and junk news, which is more about education and communication rather than, deterrence or scrutiny of platforms. So if we're talking about human rights, I think this is an important point to make. And disinformation is really a complex phenomenon, cannot be simply regulated away. But obviously, given the public harm, there's a need for public action. So the approach we have is more about transparency measures and addressing the systemic risks. And the aim is really not to regulate content, but rather to ensure that the platforms put in place resources and processes needed to protect public health, democracy, and fundamental rights. You mentioned the changes in the way people communicate in terms of how they use platforms, and there is indeed a shift to private messaging apps, which is a challenge, because simply switching groups of thousands of users to closed doesn't relieve platforms of the diligence and legal obligations. So this will require very careful thinking that we're doing right now about features that can help users identify and check disinformation. Now, on the question of concerns and gaps, I'd say there are 3 or 4 I would name. What we can safely assume, I think, is that there needs to be a deeper understanding of the impermissible manipulative behavior, and for the industry to enable more public interest research. I think this is linked to the general lack of transparency also of platforms' policies and how they are implemented and with what impact. So this is certainly a major gap, and solving it is a precondition, I think, to improve the integrity of a peaceful information space. The other gap that we need to have in mind is, as we're revising this code of practice, a very strong point made by many, the uneven coverage in terms of languages also, which I think applies maybe also to Philippines and other places, where we see in many cases good measures being taken in the main markets or languages, but very slow rollout in smaller countries. And all democratic societies deserve, some level of protection from disinformation and large-scale manipulation. And my final point would be just to repeat what the previous speaker said. I mean, we can't do it from Brussels only. We really need researchers, platforms, experts, and I would also underline media, because online disinformation, manipulation, incitement is really a societal problem. It's not only the issue of platforms not doing something, and we cannot dissociate what is happening online with what's happening in the society, in the tangible world. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I think we're really lucky today because we have such broad representative from various voices, from civil society, from government, and we also have the platforms here today to talk to us a little bit about what they're doing. And we're lucky to have Miranda here. Miranda, thanks for joining us. I'm wondering if you could maybe jump in here and describe the extent to which social media companies and Facebook specifically are adopting conflict sensitive and human rights based approaches to some of these problems by enabling access to factual information as one example. Maria and Teresa both described how various communities might be particularly vulnerable to disinformation or social media threats. I'm wondering if maybe you could describe what Facebook's doing to protect different communities from the harmful misuse of technology.
Thank you very much, Sam. And I want to say, like others, it is an honor to be here. And as Facebook's inaugural Director of Human Rights, I also want to acknowledge the suffering, the advocacy, the passion, and the pain that lies behind this conversation, because it's very, very important for so many sectors and for so many people on the ground in the Philippines and around the world. I can't speak on behalf of all platforms. I work at one company, but what I can say is that obviously it's when we talk about platforms and social media or even technology and peace building, we're talking about a much wider group of social media companies than just Facebook and Twitter. And that's increasingly the case as we have new and other entrants, both local and global, available and highly adopted in different markets. And of those companies, they're not all the same. They have different levels of resourcing, different philosophies, different missions. They also have very different user characteristics, some of them, and resourcing. So I'm lucky to say that at Facebook, in the last 3 years, we have actually sought to adopt conflict-sensitive and human rights-based approaches. And our mission, which is voice, community, and social impact, aligns fairly well with global human rights principles, right? Both the exercise of rights, supporting people to exercise rights, and a far greater variety of rights than only freedom of expression, but which is itself foundational. And is also, as we've all noted, a vector for harassment and abuse of rights by different kinds of actors, whether intentionally or non-intentionally. And that these platforms are so large and the user base is so varied that all human behaviors we have are also manifested online. And some of them are specifically developed for online. So I'll try and speak briefly, but basically say I'll try and touch on 3 aspects of any platform, which would be content policies, operational infrastructure, and product development. When we talk about product, it's important to know that any platform has thousands and thousands of features, millions of lines of code, and different creations that goes into one particular piece of software or one app. So since 2017 and the extraordinarily and dreadful situation in Myanmar, Facebook has actively sought to prevent misuse of the platform in situations of violent conflict or atrocity crimes. And we do have a formalized program to identify and prioritize countries at highest risk of widespread violence or atrocity crimes. And we use that prioritization to invest in product or other changes to mitigate the risk our products can be misused to feed the violence. And we're public about that. It does take some decoding. And so I think awareness is low, but I hope it will, over time, we will do a better job at connecting glue and relationships to improve that awareness. But we prioritize those groups of countries most likely to be at risk of conflict in order to focus language support, content moderation, or technical resources, like the development of machine learning tools and classifiers that could proactively detect hate speech and lower its distribution. So I want to be clear to people on this panel and around the world that in many markets, we are actively seeking to invest in and develop the technology that limits the distribution of hateful or policy violating content or content that otherwise is a defiance of human rights principles, particularly Article 20 of the ICCPR, and that can feed violent conflict. And that's already live now in many of these locations, but takes huge resources to implement. We actively seek to learn local contexts and communities through on-the-ground research, co-learning, and sometimes co-designing products, which is where we take normal UX user research processes, which are one of the best things about working in tech, and also try and seek to explicitly co-design using external expertise of people from local communities and civil society. We're expanding and seek to expand trust and safety and moderator capacities in local languages. I think we officially serve more than 70 languages, and people use the platform in hundreds more, including, as I think Daniel noted, very difficult and poorly resourced languages, many of which have linguistically very complex features like diglossia, which can be really, really hard to work with. And we seek to develop and improve our technology. So some examples of tools we've implemented specifically to reduce risks of conflict or the platforms contributing to conflict or atrocity crimes, including reducing the distribution of inflammatory content, notifying users before they reshare older graphic images that can be used to spread misinformation, reducing the distribution of content containing specific hashtags, and a variety of other features, one of which, most powerful for limiting misinformation and disinformation, is actually introducing gentle friction to limit the deep reshares of frequently reshared content, because all of the data that we have indicates that the speed and the frequency of frequently reshared content is a major way of spreading misinformation. And we publicly announced product features to damp that down at the onset of COVID last year. And I do want to emphasize that the product features are the most impactful kind of information.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for kind of this big, broad overview of some of the steps that Facebook is taking to combat disinformation and other various misuses of the technology. I know Daniel has to go here in a couple of minutes, and so I really kind of wanted to give him an opportunity to jump in before he leaves to describe some of the various promising initiatives in the EU and what's kind of being done there to stem the effects of disinformation and reduce conflict. And maybe if you want to describe where you think some more work needs to be done before you hop off here, I think our audience would really value your perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, I apologize both to the audience and the co-panelists for jumping the queue. So in terms of what are the initiatives, I have to start with a code of practice on disinformation that I mentioned we will issue in 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks, a guidance setting out how platforms should step up the measures to address disinformation, strengthening the current self-regulatory code. And the aim is basically twofold. One is to move towards what we call co-regulation and define disinformation-related standards in line with Digital Services Act, which is the general horizontal hard legislation that we proposed in December to define legal obligations for the very large online platforms to assess and address systemic risks, not only associated with illegal content, but also potentially, conflict enhancing content. But it should also be flexible and future-proof to make platforms more accountable and safe by design, if I can make it very short, and enabling, a more transparent information diet and healthy conversations. Then I will say that there is a visible shift in the EU in cooperation among institutions, but also multi-sectoral networks. For instance, a Commission has funded the setting up of the so-called European Digital Media Observatory. That will be an umbrella for multidisciplinary community of fact-checkers, academic researchers, other relevant stakeholders, to tackle the phenomenon, to look at media literacy, etc. Maybe to make a link to today's event, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue is working on using social and digital media also in peacemaking itself, and is funded by the Service for Foreign Policy Instruments, which is a service of the European Commission. And of course, there are many amazing, and that's maybe a nice ending, there are many amazing civil society initiatives. I know that in Germany, for instance, there's a coalition of researchers, experts, and activists that is currently forming to detect, expose misinformation and hate campaigns, disinformation, sorry, and hate campaigns rather. I know that there's a Dutch gaming platform to do simulations and teach this way media literacy. So this is to end on a positive note, and I would really encourage everyone to see this as a societal phenomenon and not purely as a legal or platform specific issue. And I hope we can push for more transparency in the online environment, which is a large responsibility also for us to set the conditions and for the platforms to adhere to these conditions better than until now. But I think it's also a goal for all of us to cooperate together on various maybe more innovative initiatives. Thank you very much. I apologize again for having to run, but it was a pleasure and honor to be here with you.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to maybe pivot to Maria. You have such a great way of kind of painting the picture of the challenges, but also you're very thoughtful in terms of thinking about solutions and very passionate about advocating for those solutions. And so I'd really love to hear what you think about really who should play a leading role in responding to some of these threats to peace building, and maybe describe your vision for what needs to really change to stem the harmful spread of disinformation and ensure human rights sensitive technology more broadly.
Yeah, so it's too bad Daniel had to leave, but I would say solutions like media literacy, or let's just take that because that's been touted as one of the ways to do it. It isn't really a solution, because what's happened is that everything that we do in the world, whether it's journalism or democracy, is a thinking slow process, right? Daniel Kahneman's two ways of thinking, the systems of thinking for human beings. But the platforms are designed for a thinking fast process, far more instinctive. It's insidiously manipulative of our emotions. And I say this, I hate using these words because, I drank the Kool-Aid. We set up Rappler on Facebook. Right? And if the search had worked better, we would never have done our own website. And I haven't given up. We remain one of Facebook's partners. Miranda, thank you for being here. But at the same time, I think in order to find a solution, there will have to be political will in the leadership, not to play a whack-a-mole game of this kind of, we dive down a rabbit hole, whether it's content moderation and then we'll whack-a-mole, or whether it's machine learning, because frankly, machine learning and AI are not going to be able to deal with this ever-changing, not fast enough to prevent the harms that are happening to people like me, right? Because it will always be a step ahead of whatever big data tech solution you will find. So I think part of it is having the political will to say, we are going to have to switch off the huge fast growth. It's already slowing down, but we're going to have to switch it off just a little bit more, make a bit less money, so that we're not appealing to the worst side of human nature. So that's the first three steps. Technology. So technology gets its guardrails. Daniel talked about some of those, but I think those guardrails have got to be behavioral economics. Shoshana Zuboff calls her book 750 pages long. You can get a summary, but like surveillance capitalism, right? It's in the business. The second thing is the truth tellers, journalists, right? That's the very same platforms, and it's not just Facebook. I say Silicon Valley all combined, because the journalists who are doing their jobs, who are doing our jobs, and you can see this from the World Press Freedom Index. You can see this from every kind, from Oxford University's Computational Propaganda Research Project. The dangers have increased to us, and yet simultaneously the business model has collapsed. precisely because the social media platforms have taken the lion's share. You're talking about, tens of billions of dollars annually in profit. I'm not really jealous. You can have that if you make it safe for us. So that's the second thing, is some kind of mechanism to help independent media survive, to help journalists get through this valley of death as we find the right balance between tech and the gatekeepers of tech. I always used to say, like many years ago, I said, this is going to have to entwine. The future of journalism is intertwined with tech, and tech will have to become gatekeepers. Coronavirus spurred that. And finally, the last solution is in communities. All of this stuff we're talking about impacts people, real people. We saw this, the incitement to violence that was seeded on social media in August 2019, the narrative of election fraud, right, pops up January 6th with mob violence in Capitol Hill. Online violence doesn't stay online, and the violence on social media inevitably erupts in the real world. So we have to think about them together. The last part is that even though the US skated through and we have a new administration, the problems aren't solved, because you have 70 plus more voters, millions of voters who voted for President Trump, who went out on Capitol Hill. This is like, and I say this all the time, so I apologize to those who have heard me, but it's like having a virus of lies in the virtual world, and that virus of lies is as contagious as the coronavirus. And when you get infected with that, it changes your worldview. And it takes a long time to change that. So if your shared reality is torn apart, if anger and hate incite you, you're not going to automatically just come back because someone gave you a fact. In fact, you're more likely to disbelieve it. Your cognitive bias is set in place. So that's where it would be great to bring the discussion there, because the last part I hear very little about is how the technology we are using changes emergent behavior, creates emergent behavior. What I mean by that is, like, I think one of the wisest people, the wisest statement has come from a biologist, E.O. Wilson, who said that the biggest problems we face are Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. It's that emergent behavior that I worry about.
Thank you for that, Maria. Miranda, maybe you could jump in here and describe some of the challenges that platforms are facing in responding to conflict and violence online. I think you painted a really great picture of some of the initiatives and the first steps that Facebook is taking. But where do you think more work needs to be done? And does this kind of work involve collaboration between platforms and other actors? Kind of what's your vision for the future here in terms of like next steps and ensuring that social media is a safe space for everybody?
I am speaking as a jaundiced human rights activist who also worked before social media, right? And even before the internet. I'm not sure we can make social media or the world safe for everybody. And I want to be realistic about that goal, okay? But let me say that in terms of, I think, in framing what platforms need to do and what changes we need to say, I want to also note that a few months ago, in fact, 6 weeks ago, Facebook initiated its first corporate human rights policy, explicitly linking the platform to global human rights standards and framing them in terms of implementation, oversight, the need to respond to and support defenders, and also committing to report on its human rights insights and actions annually. So I think if we want to use that as a moment to leverage political will and also to mobilize around a more, as an opportunity for creating new relationships and mobilizing additional action, I do want to let people know that that framework and that commitment is there. I think in my vision, some of the greatest challenges we face in responding to conflict is that our technology is not godlike, right? And that physical violence and online violence occurs with many different behaviors in many different ways for many reasons. And of course, it's thousands of different problem sets that in this panel and elsewhere we refer to as one thing. And so working in the tech space, the challenge is to break that down into challenges for actionable insight. For example, we haven't mentioned bullying and harassment. We haven't mentioned incitement to violence. In our focus on disinformation and misinformation, that takes many different forms. And Maria, you're right, machine learning isn't the answer to every problem or even most problems. It's just one kind of answer where our cybersecurity work and the development of policies that are focused on behaviors and networks of behaviors is one area where I have great interest, and I would indicate to people, I think this is where we, across the ecosystem, really, any cooperation, any insights will pay off. And that's leads me to another thing. There is a great asymmetry of skill across all of us right now and across all different fields, as well as the asymmetry of data that people have related to. So one reason I'm at this panel and doing my job is because I want to create concrete ways to develop shared insights and shared skills across peace building, across human rights, across tech, to share knowledge and drive actionable insights. And I'll leave you with two thoughts. In the last 4 weeks, Facebook has launched a couple of features that are really, really important for user protection. A few weeks ago, we launched a product feature to give users control of who comments on their public posts. That is probably the most important mitigation against bullying and harassment we've ever been able to launch. And it's a result of feedback and research and engineering work from civil society, from targeted defenders, and from the world community that urged us to implement this. That's an example of great progress that needs to happen, and it's a first step for 1,000 other things we need to do. But it's really important, and we should mark and celebrate it. The second example is that we launched a locked profile feature in Myanmar, repurposed from South Asia, that prevents surveillance of vulnerable users that millions of people have begun to use even in the first week. So while there is an infinite amount to do, an infinite amount of skill and data to share in an ecosystem where the sweep of authoritarianism and harassment is across all parts of our world, not just social media, I'd say that progress and actionable insights are possible, but we need to develop the bonds and the modes of cooperation that allow us to push those actions further. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for those insights, Miranda. Robert, I know you've been thinking a lot about how new technologies can be used for mediation and mediation and peace building. So I'm wondering if maybe you could elaborate on some of the opportunities created by new technologies and social media in these spaces.
Thank you. Let me give a few examples, mention a few areas. Firstly, of course, mediation has traditionally been a communication process based on face-to-face interaction and in-person trust building. I think, however, that new technologies can build new structures and ways of interacting that can complement and strengthen this process. Digital technologies can allow for more frequent, discrete, real-time communication between the mediator and parties, and can supplement in-person communications to build and maintain trust. Secondly, social media can also help mediation teams during the preparation of mediation processes as well as during them. Tools such as Twitter and Facebook can be used to understand local attitudes towards conflict, the position of the conflict partners and to get real-time updates on current events. This creates also the potential for mediators to preempt conflicts before they turn to violence. Thirdly, social media can contribute to peace building more widely. For instance, many of the policies developed by Facebook and Twitter around elections could be adapted to also protect peace talks. Misinformation about talks could be labeled in local languages with links to information such as official statements by the UN, and content that aims to intimidate negotiations could be clearly labeled. Finally, we also as Sweden support specific initiatives. We fund the project by the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which was mentioned earlier on, with groundbreaking work on cyber mediation. And we also, as Sweden, have offered to host UNICEF's new Office of Innovation here in Sweden as another example of what we want to do to deepen our engagement with the UN and support for the UN in harnessing the opportunities of new technologies. Let me also, on a final note, thank fellow digital panelists for very insightful comment, and also join others in congratulating Maria Ressa on a very well-deserved award.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Robert. And, I think it's really great to hear about some of the positive initiatives at the government level and various collaborations with international organizations and civil society actors to really use technology for social good and for peace building processes. Teresa, I'm wondering if you could maybe come back to some of the ideas that you were discussing earlier around solutions. Where or what do you think is the most pressing solution that we really need to enact as a society to address some of these challenges? And how do you think that we could better leverage technology for peace building processes around the world? Oh.
I'm sorry. If I have to choose what I think is the most important angle to really fight this this problem with disinformation, is really to bet in restoring trust on media. This is very important. We need to have important and strong media. We need to have investigative journalism if you want to combat disinformation and misinformation. It's very dangerous if we follow a path that is going to shrink the space of freedom of the media. This is very, very dangerous. And that's the reason why, once again, I underline the importance, first of all, of having a multilateral approach. We are in a globalized world, so we need this kind of multilateral involvement. A multi-stakeholder approach, as we need the political level, but we need also, once again, let me repeat, civil society as well as the business world involved to find the best solutions. Because if we don't have trust in media, then we will have safety of journalists really threatened. we will have, and not only online, but offline, because this is another problem, that the online harassment, the online threats, they jump in the offline life. And this is really what's happening everywhere in the world, and this is very concerning. And at the same time, this distrust of media also entails and really threatens media sustainability. So if people think that I don't need to pay for information, if they think that low informative products have the same value than investigative journalism, then of course media will suffer, and will suffer a lot. And what we'll see in the future is that this important role played by the media in our democratic societies will be less and less important, and will with serious implications, with serious impact in the functioning of our democratic societies. So we need to be very careful, and we need really to rebuild trust. And for that, we need to rebuild the ecosystem of the media ecosystem and the social media ecosystem. It's the best way to fight disinformation. Otherwise, it will be like to try to empty the ocean with a small spoon. It will be an endless and an impossible task. Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you so much for that, Teresa. We have a couple minutes left now. I just want to remind the audience that they can submit questions through the app, the platform used to connect to the forum. In the meantime, I'm wondering if our panelists have any questions for each other. We have such a diverse group of voices here. And so I'm wondering if, there are any questions for each other that you want to ask.
I do want to ask a question, if it's okay, of Miranda.
Yeah, let's go
right?
for it. Yeah.
Cool. So I'll pick up from what Teresa said about trust, right? And how crucial trust is, because crucial to any conflict resolution, to finding peace, is the ability of the people in conflict to come together with trust. And from what I've seen, the design of the platforms, and not just Facebook, but social media in general, are the ones that have used factors for growth, like using friends of friends that more polarize, that divide. Because in the Philippines, for example, I saw if you're pro Duterte, you move further right because you grow your platform getting using the algorithm friends of friends. If you're anti-Duterte, you move further left, and then over time it grows, right? So trust, and then the design, I think. How is there thinking about how to deal with the fundamental design? Because so far what we've heard from the platforms have been kind of like going down each of the rabbit hole. But, is there a way of looking at it? Have you guys talked about it? And then if so, how can we help?
What a great question, and one for which I may not have the easiest possible answer. But this reminds me very much of what it must have been like when radio started, and the advent of radio and its impact and its association, in particular, manipulation by authoritarian regimes and figures in the 1920s and 30s. And also I think about Rwanda constantly and Rwandan radio, right? Because it's not that I'm going to say it's the same. It's just that, oh my God, the challenges are familiar, of framing regulation, of understanding use, of limiting the harm, and then saying how can we be aware of, encourage the positive uses while limiting the downside on a much bigger scale. And so, yeah, for me, I've noted here that the at-risk countries work that I've been involved with in my 2 years at Facebook is very much about integrity work, as they call it, that includes civic integrity, how to ensure that good quality information gets through, how not to put your finger on the scale to unknowingly or unintentionally assist one side of a regular social debate against another, how to protect elections. But also, more importantly, I think that you're alluding to changes to the algorithm, which were announced in 2017, that was meant to, and 2018 worked on for focusing on closer connections with family and friends. And I want to note that we speak about that and some very, very specific other product work in our public Facebook response to our Sri Lanka Human Rights Impact Assessment. So folks on this panel haven't seen that. That's one of the few really detailed public pieces of information about this work stream that goes to the level of, just very bald and fairly crisp enumeration of interventions. And again, after US 2020, where we released a lot of work, a lot of information about integrity efforts that obviously dominated a lot of company thinking. At the same time, we were trying to protect the Myanmar elections, the Brazil elections, and the Myanmar and the Ethiopia elections, which then got delayed. Mark Zuckerberg again this year announced a look at how to reduce anger in newsfeed. There has been a lot of works with these huge numbers of complex surfaces. How do we impact X there, strip it out of recommendations, stop automation, to ensure that users have a positive experience? We know that, for example, the global prevalence metric now of hate speech or policy violating hate speech on Facebook is something like, I think, 8 pieces out of 10,000. So a very low prevalence metric globally. But that doesn't mean much, because we need to understand how it works in a specific content or context, how it works at a specific moment. So, Maria, I would say that yes, I think these conversations are impactful inside the company and outside. And I think you've seen some quite specific, quite public re-engineering efforts around it. I also think that the sky is the limit, right? That we are the beginning of this journey for good or for bad together with the rest of the world at this incredibly pressured time, when the folks who had the early adopter advantage of the internet, the good folks, the civil society, the human rights defenders, the technical perfecters, we've lost it, right? And that early advantage has gone, and we're in a completely different phase. So I'll stop there, but I think it's, we underestimate the power of the motivation to provide a great user experience for users as a powerful tool for change.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I would really like to thank our audience for attending today. I'd like to thank our various speakers, Robert, Teresa, Maria, Miranda, and Daniel, of course, who had to leave us a little early. I'd like to thank you all for joining. I think this has been a really fascinating discussion around, a lot of the contemporary challenges that we're facing as societies, as citizens, as democracies around the world, thinking about the ways that new technology is introducing new legal, regulatory, human problems around freedom of speech, freedom of the press, conflict, and human rights more broadly. But I also think we've begun a very productive conversation around how to start addressing some of these new challenges, thinking about the role of technology's algorithms, thinking about building trust within communities again, thinking about mediation processes and how technology can be leveraged to better communicate and facilitate peace. And so I'd really like to, again, thank my panelists and thank the audience for today's session. Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.